3.
Hello, welcome to Richard III. This is one of Shakespeare's early plays, and it's a history play. The more you know about English history, the more that this will come in handy, and that's why we've got some links to some genealogy and some other things on the website to help you figure out who is who. It's also a very self-consciously theatrical play. It's based on the medieval morality play, where there are devil characters who are the most popular characters in the play. And they like to come right down to the audience and explain what's going on and make jokes with the audience. Richard III is actually modeled on the devil or vice character in these medieval morality plays. He likes to keep cluing us in on what he plans to do and confiding in us. And that's something that is a lot of fun, but it also helps us keep track of what's been going on in the play. The Elizabethan stage had a thrust stage that went right out into the middle of the yard, so the actor was very close to his public and was able to lean down and actually speak to them. So it's really, really helpful. The structure of the Elizabethan theater really helps this play. Now, Richard is actually a holdover from some other plays. Richard III is the fourth in a set of 4 plays. The first 3 are Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. And in Henry VI, Richard was already cluing us into the fact that he was this evil, mean guy who was desperate to get the crown. And the problem with that is Richard is the youngest brother, and he's got just about no chance of getting the crown unless a lot of things happen. And his big aim in life is to make those things happen. He's also complaining about how he is somehow deformed or disabled, and that this is his excuse, since he can't be a lover, that this will be his excuse to be a politician, I guess would be the best way to put it. One of the big arguments is how much is this really based on history? And the answer is not a lot. It's based a lot on propaganda. Richard III couldn't possibly have been as disabled as Shakespeare portrays him, because he wouldn't have been able to be the warrior that he was. And if you look at the portrait that we have at the top of this webpage, you can see he doesn't look like that. So that's something that you might like to look into a little bit. In Henry VI, Richard starts to talk about his frustration, about how far away the crown is. Whiles I live to account this world but hell, until my misshaped trunk that bears this head be round and paled with a glorious crown, and yet I know how not to get the crown, for many lives stand between me and home. And I, like one lost in a thorny wood that rents the thorns and is rent with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way, not knowing how to find the open air, but toiling desperately to find it out, torment myself to catch the English crown, and from that torment I will free myself or hew my way out with a bloody axe. And then he talks about his ability to fake it, his ability as an actor. And this is where the play becomes very theatrical. Why, I can smile, and murder while I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon, take another Troy. I could add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this, and cannot get a crown? Tut! Were it further off, I'd pluck it down. So when Shakespeare's audience walked into Richard III, they already knew what they were getting. And at the very beginning of this play, what has happened is that Richard's elder brother has succeeded in becoming king, something that they were aiming for, but that they never thought they'd have. And all the civil wars that have been going on have come to a temporary stop. Things are very good. Richard's older brother is fairly handsome, and he's used to sort of getting it on with various different ladies. And what Richard says in this opening speech is that even War himself has decided to cool it and start courting ladies, but that he doesn't feel that that's something he can do. And so he's going to be a villain instead. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound up with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums turned to merry meetings. Grim-visaged War hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before an wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time until thus behold my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. Now you can hear in that there's a pun that the Renaissance was particularly fond of on son and son, this son of York. And Richard is the shadow in the sun. He is something that there's all this references to shadows and suns. Pay attention to that because it comes up later on. And so his plan is to set up his second oldest brother, Clarence, up against the king. He's spreading rumors that there are prophecies and all kinds of rumors that Clarence is going to have the king's sons killed. One of the things about this play is that curses and prophecies always come true. That's very convenient if you think about it, because later when Queen Margaret spouts off all these curses, you can see it happening more or less in the order that she cursed everybody. And so in this particular case, there are prophecies which says that G of Edward's heirs, the murderers shall be. And of course, what this means is that Edward has decided that his second oldest brother, George, Duke of Clarence, is going to have his kids killed. What he forgets is that his youngest brother is Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And so it's true in the end, but this is not something that Richard even himself is thinking of. And so he's looking forward to getting Clarence in the Tower. This day should Clarence closely be mewed up about a prophecy which says that G of Edward's heirs the murderers shall be. Dive thoughts down to my soul. Here comes Clarence. Brother, good day. Now, that's one of the things. You can see Richard being two-faced, and we can see the way he shifts automatically from playing this villain that we've been confiding with to this nice brother. Clarence, later we'll see, has no idea that Richard is as evil and creepy as he is, and even in his worst nightmares can't imagine that Richard would do any harm to him. Clarence is sent off to the Tower, there to await whatever is supposed to happen to him. And in the next scene, we see Lady Anne coming out. She's not with the corpse of her husband. A lot of the time, people think that that's who it is. It's actually her father-in-law, the previous king, Henry VI. And she's very distressed about the fact that Richard had her husband killed, and also personally killed the king, whom she's lamenting over. She's distressed, the corpse is lying there, and she curses Richard's future wife. If ever he have wife, let her be made more miserable by the life of him than I am made by my young lord and thee. Now this is a terrible mistake, because she's accidentally cursed herself. She doesn't realize it, but she is going to be Richard's wife, and that is all the terrible things that she wished on Richard's wife are going to happen to her. Richard comes in, stops the funeral, if you can imagine this. He actually tells them that they have to put down the body because otherwise he'll have them killed. And then he starts to engage in this dialogue with Lady Anne. And he tries to tell her that all of the things that he did, all the murders he committed, were because she was just so pretty that he couldn't help himself. What's interesting about this is she never actually questions that this is possible. She never actually says, well, it doesn't matter how pretty I am, you still are responsible for your actions. And this is something like a parody of the way sonneteers act. All the sonnets of Shakespeare's time, when people carried on about how I'll kill myself if you don't love me, take some pity on me, cruel lady. Richard is actually doing that, except that he really puts Anne in a tough spot. And so what he tries to tell her is that she has actually made him weep, which even the death of his own father could not do. In that sad time my manly eyes did scorn an humble tear, and what these sorrows could not thence exhale, thy beauty hath, and made them blind with weeping. I never sued to friend or enemy. My tongue could never learn sweet smoothing word, but now thy beauty is proposed my fee, my proud heart sues, and prompts my tongue to speak. Teach not thy lips such scorn, for it was made for kisses, lady, not for such contempt. If thy revengeful heart cannot forgive, lo, here I lend thee this sharp-pointed sword, which, if thou please to hide in this true bosom, I lay it naked to the deadly stroke, and humbly beg the death upon my knee. Nay, do not pause, for I did kill King Henry, but 'twas thy beauty that provoked me. Nay, now dispatch, 'twas I that killed young Edward, but 'twas thy heavenly face which set me on. And she drops the sword. Take up the sword again, or take up me. That's really painted her into a corner. A lot of people want to know how it is that she can go from such grief over her husband to immediately pretty much becoming engaged to Richard. He gives her a ring and she accepts it, which is tantamount to accepting his proposals. I think it's really because she has just lost her husband. She's in a very distressed emotional state. But the fact that she does concede to him does not make Richard like her anymore. In fact, it makes him respect her less. Was ever woman in this humor wooed? Was ever woman in this humor won? I'll have her, but I will not keep her long. What? I that killed her husband and her father, to take her in her heart's extremest hate, with curses in her mouth, tears in her eyes, the bleeding witness of my hatred by, having God, her conscience, and these bars against me, and I no friends to back my suit at all, but the plain devil and dissembling looks, and yet to win her, all the world to nothing. Ha! That's tremendous contempt you can hear. And he says that she somehow must see some handsomeness in him that he doesn't think he really even has. My dukedom, to a beggarly denier, I do mistake my person all this while. Upon my life she finds, though I cannot, myself to be a marvellous proper man. Albeit changes for a looking-glass, and entertain a score or two of tailors, ready fashions to adorn my body. Since I am crept in favour with myself, I will maintain it with some little cost. But first I'll turn yon fellow in his grave, and then return lamenting to my love. Shine out, fair sun, till I have found a glass, that I may see my shadow as I pass. And so you can see the shadow and the sun coming back again. But remember, Richard's excuse for being such a villain was that he thought he could never win the love of any lady. And we can see in this that actually that's not true. He can, but it doesn't make any difference to him. He doesn't care. In this next scene, what we see is Queen Margaret. She's the former queen. A lot of people think that adversity makes you into a better, sweeter, nicer person. But Queen Margaret doesn't seem to think that at all. Adversity has just made her really bitter. She's supposed to be exiled on pain of death, and she doesn't care. She says death would be preferable to the way she's living now. She comes in. The queen and her brothers are arguing with the faction that are Richard and his crowd, and they have been arguing, and what she thinks of them as dogs fighting over her lawful prize. And she is really, really bitter, and she curses all of them. What? Were you snarling all before I came, ready to catch each other by the throat, and turn you all your hatred now on me? Did York's dread curse prevail so much with heaven that Henry's death, my lovely Edward's death, their kingdom's loss, my woeful banishment should all but answer for that peevish brat? Can curses pierce the clouds and enter heaven? Why then, give way, dull clouds, to my quick curses. As are by murder, by surfeit die your king, Edward thy son that now is Prince of Wales, for Edward our son that was Prince of Wales, die in his youth by like untimely violence. Thyself a queen, for myself that was a queen, outlive thy glory like my wretched self. Long mayest thou live to wail thy children's death, and to see another as I see thee now, decked in thy rights as thou art stalled in mine. Long live thy happy days before thy death, and after many lengthened hours of grief, die neither mother, wife, nor England's queen. Rivers and Dorset, you were standers by, and so wast thou, Lord Hastings, when my son was stabbed with bloody daggers. God, I pray him that none of you may live his natural age, but by some unlooked-for accident cut off. And Richard tries to interrupt her. Have done thy charm, thou hateful withered hag. And leave out thee. Stay, dog, for thou shalt hear me. If heaven have any grievous plague in store exceeding those that I can wish on thee, oh, let them keep it till thy sins be ripe, and then hurl down their indignation on thee, the troubler of the poor world's peace. Thy friends suspect for traitors while thou livest, and take deep traitors for thy deepest friends. No sleep close up that deadly eye of thine, unless it be with some tormenting dream affrights thee with a hell of ugly devils. Thou elvish-marked, abortive, rooting hog, thou that was sealed in thy nativity, the slave of nature and the son of hell. And this goes on at some length. Richard says that he's not impressed by this, but her curses are fairly comprehensive. Richard is supposed to be the instrument of all this horrible stuff that's going to happen to everybody else. She calls him a hog, partly because that's a nasty thing to call him, but partly because on Richard's coat of arms there was a wild boar. And it's very suitable to his nature that he roots about, and wild boars are also quite dangerous and savage. So she uses that analogy to explain what's going to happen to him. She isn't angry at Buckingham. She says Buckingham wasn't responsible for what happened, but she does prophesy that something bad will happen to Buckingham. Buckingham, she says, don't have anything to do with Richard. Take heed of yonder dog. Look, where he fawns, he bites, and where he bites, his venom tooth will rankle to the death. So she says, beware of Richard. Buckingham is polite about this. He has no intention of taking her advice, and so that comes to an end. Margaret is, all of her curses are going to come true in the course of the play, and then she's going to come back and sort of gloat over how this goes. Clarence is still in the tower. He's having nightmares, and his nightmare is that his brother and he were going off to France, and that Richard knocks him overboard accidentally, and that he drowns. You'll notice that even in his dream, he can't think of Richard intentionally killing him. But this is something that Richard, in fact, has planned on doing. And so he sent 2 murderers to kill Clarence. Now, Clarence is filled with conscience. He feels really bad about some of the things he's done in order to help his brother become king. And so he prays for God to spare his innocent wife and his poor children. It's interesting that he blames himself and his older brother, Edward, blames himself, but that Richard doesn't seem to have any conscience problems at all. At least we don't get to hear about them until substantially later. Now, when these 2 murderers come in, believe it or not, this is a kind of black comedy. They start to argue over, well, should we kill him while he's asleep? Well, no, he'll say it was done cowardly when he awakes. Well, that's obviously ridiculous. And they start arguing over conscience, whether or not it's legitimate to kill him. When Clarence wakes up, he tries to beg them not to kill him. And this is something Richard warned them about. He says, Clarence is a really good speaker. Don't let him do this. And what happens is that he says, why have you come? Why have you looked so pale? Who sent you hither? Wherefore do you come? To murder me? Aye. So, if you come to murder me, yeah, that's about right. And then later, when he's actually murdered, he turns to one of the murderers and he says, my friend, I spy some pity in your looks. Please plead with me. And really the only thing that the murderer can say to him is, look out over there. And of course, it's the first murderer coming behind him with a knife. Oh, well, that's the way it goes. Clarence is right about the idea that he drowns, but he doesn't get to drown in the sea. He dies a very undignified death in a barrel of wine. So, yes, he does get to drown, but, dreams are never, they're always true, but they don't always exactly come out in the way you think they will. At the beginning of Act 2, Edward is afraid, King Edward, that he's going to die soon, and he's trying to get everybody to kiss and make up. They're not very happy about this, and Richard comes in saying, oh, I'm in great shape here. I'm going to be so sweet to everybody. And in fact, he says that, he's at peace with everybody. If I unwittingly or in my rage have aught committed that is hardly borne, if by any in this presence I desire to reconcile me to his friendly peace, 'tis death to me to be at enmity. I hate it and desire all good men's love. First, madam, I entreat true peace of you, which I will purchase with my duteous service. Of you, my noble cousin Buckingham, if ever any grudge were lodged between us, and you, Lord Rivers, and of Dorset, that all without desert have frowned on me. Dukes, earls, lords, gentlemen, indeed of all, I do not know that Englishman alive with whom my soul is any jot at odds more than the infant that is born tonight. I thank my God for my humility. Now, of course, this is Richard being holier than thou, and the Queen makes the mistake of saying, well, bring Clarence in. Let's be reconciled to him. And Richard does an emotional 180. Why, madam, have I offered love for this to be so flouted in this royal presence? Who knows not that the gentle Duke is dead? Who knows that he is dead? Who knows he is? Well, this is a shock. And Richard tells the king, it's your fault. You signed the execution order. Now, of course, that isn't precisely true. Edward also signed a pardon, and it was supposed to let Clarence out, but Richard managed to have the murderers sent. And Edward prophesies on his deathbed that terrible things are coming to England. Deathbed prophecies really particularly are important because the person is so close to heaven that they should be able to see the future. O God, I fear thy justice will take hold on me and you and mine and yours for this. Come, Hastings, help me to my closet. Oh, poor Clarence. And he's particularly upset because he's just been asked to pardon somebody else, a servant who's killed somebody in a drunken fight. And he says, why didn't anyone come and plead for my brother? Why didn't anyone ask me to take pity on him? And now it's too late. So Edward prophesies that horrible things are going to happen. I'm not going to say very much about this next scene, although it's worthwhile reading. You get to see Richard's mother. Richard's mother is the one person who doesn't seem to think Richard is very good. She really knows him. The other thing is that later we're going to get to see the Duke of York and the Prince of Wales. Pretty much in Shakespeare, whenever you see some bright, prattly young kid who's a little bit too smart for his own britches, you can pretty well count on it. 90% of the time, they're going to die. So just bear that in mind. We get in scene 3 a little thing with all of the citizens coming out and talking to each other. Now, this is the first time we've seen anything outside the high political circles of the court. We've pretty much restricted our vision to them, and now we get to see the position of the man in the street. And they're very worried because now Edward's son is going to be king, and he's young. And they say, woe to that land that's governed by a child. They know perfectly well that when Henry VI became king, he was only 9 months old, and that creates a power vacuum in which the counselors start to step and they start to fight over who really gets to be king. And the first citizen tries to say, oh, things aren't going to be that bad, don't worry. And the third citizen says, don't count on it. When clouds are seen, wise men put on their cloaks. When great leaves fall, then winter is at hand. When the sun sets, who doth not look for night? Untimely storms make men expect a dearth. All may be well, but if God sorted it so, 'tis more than we deserve, or I expect. So he's saying, look at the signs of the times, you know. It's not something that you can expect. It's not going to go very well. Queen Elizabeth, who is Edward's queen, is very concerned about what's going to happen to her sons. She's taken her younger son into sanctuary. The idea was supposed to be, if you've read or seen The Hunchback of Notre Dame, that if you go into the church, they can't take you out of it for 40 days. And the excuse then becomes, well, children can't claim sanctuary because they haven't done anything wrong. So therefore, they can't claim sanctuary, which doesn't make a lot of sense. The whole point, though, this is Buckingham's idea, is to get both of the princes together. Because if they just kill one, then Richard can't become king. Both of them have to die. Buckingham, by this point, as you can tell, is deep in with Richard. He's got all of these plans to do this kind of stuff. York, the youngest of the two brothers, and also is named Richard because Richard is his godfather. I know there's a lot of Richards and Edwards. That's just the way it is, and that's the way it's written. Starts to yammer with his uncle. I pray you, uncle, give me your dagger. My dagger, little cousin, with all my heart. A beggar brother of my kind uncle that I know will give, and being but a toy, which is no grief to give. A greater gift than that I'll give my cousin. A greater gift? Oh, that's the sword to it. Ay, gentle cousin, were it light enough. And so they start talking, and the Prince of Wales knows you don't say stuff like this to Richard. And in fact, what he says is something like, well, because I'm little like an ape, he means that you should bear me on his shoulder. That's a reference to Richard's hunchback. Nobody has had the guts to say anything about Richard's hunchback. And so at that point, if that kid wasn't going to get killed, Richard sort of thinks, I'll get you later. Well, Hastings makes this mistake of not listening to Stanley's nightmare about the boar raising off his helm, in other words, getting his head cut off. And he makes the mistake of going to the big council to talk about the coronation. Richard, we've already seen him do these emotional 180s. And he walks off seemingly in a good mood in the middle of this coronation speech, this coronation council. The scene is called the strawberry scene because somebody goes off for strawberries in the middle of it. It's just one of those things. That's what it's called. And then he comes back in and is in a totally different mood. I pray you all, tell me what they deserve, that do conspire my death with devilish plots of damned witchcraft, and that have prevailed upon my body with their hellish charms. The tender love I bear your grace, my lord, makes me most forward in this princely presence to doom the offenders, whosoe'er they be. I say, my lord, they have deserved death. Then be your eyes the witness of their evil. Look how I am bewitched. Behold, mine arm is like a blasted sapling, withered up. And this is Edward's wife, that monstrous witch, together with that harlot, Mistress Shore, that by their witchcraft they have marked me. Now the thing is, nobody wants to say, your arm has always been like that. Because when somebody comes in and does something that's completely crazy, it's very frightening to actually confront them. And what he winds up doing is accusing Hastings of complicity, and he says, I will not dine until I have his head cut off. Lovell and Ratcliffe, look that it be done. The rest that love me, rise and follow me. And everybody knows that it's a good idea. Get up, clear the chamber, get out of there. And Hastings thinks about it, and he thinks, I should have paid attention. He thinks back on Margaret's curses. He remembers that Margaret cursed him. The same had happened when the Queen's brothers also had their heads hacked off. And one of the things that comforted them was thinking, well, yeah, but Margaret said that Hastings would have his head cut off too, so at least we're not alone. And so Hastings also thinks about the other people that are going to get it. Everyone looks back and thinks about Margaret's curses. Now, Richard's a terrific actor, as we've seen. And for a little while, he has what amounts to a kind of a vaudeville partner in the Duke of Buckingham. And Buckingham gives a little spiel about how wonderful an actor he is. And what Richard does is send him off to talk to the mayor and give them all kinds of reasons, the mayor of London, give them all kinds of reasons about why Richard should be king instead. And it's a long list of reasons suggesting that the kids are really bastards, and in fact saying something about maybe my brother was a bastard too. But he says, don't go into that too much because that's kind of smearing my mother, and she's still alive and that would kind of bother her. So this is a guy who would literally sell his own mother in order to be king. And when Buckingham comes back, he has to give the report about how it went. And he says that I gave this whole speech, I said everything you told me to say, and when mine oratory drew to an end, I bid them that did love their country's good cry, God save Richard, England's royal king! And did they so? No! God help me, they spake not a word, but like dumb statues or breathing stones stared at each other and looked deadly pale, so things didn't go nearly as well as they'd hoped. This means that they have to stage manage a scene. Now this next scene is perfect again for the Elizabethan theater. I've already talked about how Richard comes to the front of the stage, talks to us, confides to us. He's got a long to-do list that he starts checking off items on and keeping us apprised of events. But in this, we've also got a thing where the setup of the Elizabethan theater really lends itself to this. You have a balcony that's going up above, and you have people down below. And so Buckingham says, go off, go get a couple of bishops, here, take this book, tell them it's a prayer book, don't come out until I call you, and we'll do this double act. And so he's coming down, Buckingham comes in with the mayor and the alderman, and he's saying, well, we'll have to beg Richard to be king, but I don't know whether he'll do it, and he's on the flat, he's on the bottom part. And then Richard comes in with the two bishops surrounding him, and this is more of his holier-than-thou stuff. Richard says that he doesn't want to be king, and besides, if he wasn't worthy to be king, and besides, his younger siblings, his younger nephews are set up to be king, and so there's no need to. And Buckingham proceeds to give all the reasons about why he ought to be king. And Richard is trying to say, no, no, no. By now, he's got Buckingham and Richard have got the mayor going, and they're saying, oh, please, please do be king. Refuse not, mighty lord, this proffered love. Oh, make them joyful, grant their lawful suit. Alas, why would you heap this care on me? I am unfit for state and majesty. I do beseech you, take it not amiss. I cannot, nor I will not yield to you. If you refuse it, as in love and zeal, loath to depose the child, your brother's son, as well we know your tenderness of heart and gentle, kind, effeminate remorse, which we have noted in you to your kindred, and equally indeed to all estates. Yet no, where'er you accept our suit or no, your brother's son shall never reign our king, but we will plant some other in the throne, to the disgrace and downfall of your house. And in this resolution here we leave you. Come, citizens, zoons, I'll entreat no more. Oh, do not swear, my Lord of Buckingham. Now, the thing about that is that we don't think of zoons as being such a powerful oath, but zoons is a contraction of God's wounds, i.e. the wounds that Christ had on the cross. And so when Buckingham says zoons, Richard pretends to think, oh my gosh, don't say bad words like zoons. And Richard tries to pretend that he didn't really want to be king, but now he's forced to. Will you enforce me to a world of cares? Call them again. I am not made of stone, but penetrable to your kind entreaties, albeit against my conscience and my soul. Cousin of Buckingham, and sage grave men, since you will buckle fortune on my back to bear her burden, whether I will or no, I must have patience to endure the load. And he tries to say that I really didn't want this, for God doth know, and you may partly see how far I am from the desire of this. God bless your grace, we see it and will say it. And saying so, you shall say but the truth. And so he gets to be crowned with this enormous setup. It's as political a machination as anything you'll ever see today, to tell you the truth. And the one thing is, at this point, Richard has gotten everything he wanted. He's actually hewed his way to the crown with that bloody axe. And now that he's gotten everything he's wanted, will he be able to hang on to it? And that's a question for part 2 of this lecture.
Going in 5, 4, 3.
Welcome back to the second part of Richard III. When we left off, Richard had just been given the crown of England, something that he'd obviously been wanting for a long time, and something he'd stuck at nothing to achieve. This is news now to his wife and also to the other women of his family. Queen Elizabeth isn't very happy to hear that her sons are stuck in the Tower and that Richard is going to become king, but neither is Richard's wife, Anne. And she actually curses herself, and Elizabeth says, no, don't feel bad about it. This is clearly not your fault. Oh, would to God that the inclusive verge of golden metal that must round my brow were red-hot steel to sear me to the brains. Anointed let me be with deadly venom, and die ere men can say, God save the Queen. Anne seems to be very good at cursing herself, and Elizabeth says, no, go, go, poor soul. I envy not thy glory. To feed my humour, wish thyself no harm. No. Why? when he that is my husband now came to me as I followed Henry's corpse, when scarce the blood was well washed from his hands, and that dear saint which I then weeping followed, oh, when I say I looked on Richard's face, this was my wish, be thou, quoth I, accursed for making me so young, so old a widow. And when thou wedst, let sorrow haunt thy bed, and be thy wife, if any, be so mad, more miserable by the life of thee, than thou hast made me by my dear Lord's death. Lo, ere I can repeat this curse again, within so small a time my woman's heart grossly grew captive to his honey words, and proved the subject of mine own soul's curse, which hitherto hath held my eyes from rest, for never yet 1 hour in his blood did I enjoy the golden dew of sleep, but with his timorous dreams was still awaked. Besides, he hates me for my father Warwick, and will, no doubt, shortly be rid of me. Now, this is interesting because, of course, Anne is looking back at the way she cursed herself and is now reflecting on the fact that those curses have come true. But this is also the first indication that we have that Richard's conquering and Richard's murders have actually caused him to pay a price. Anne says that he's having nightmares and it's keeping her awake. And I think it's fitting that at the end of the play she becomes the subject of one of his nightmares, but we'll wait for that in its proper place. Richard has no sooner become king than he starts to worry about it. And he starts to worry about it to Buckingham. Thus high by thy advice and thy assistance is King Richard seated. But shall we wear these glories for a day? Or shall they last and we rejoice in them? Still live they, and forever let them last. Ah, Buckingham, now do I play the touch, to try if thou be current gold indeed. Young Edward lives. Think now what I would speak. Say on, my loving lord. Why, Buckingham, I say I would be king. Well, so you are, my thrice renowned lord. Ha! Am I king? 'Tis so. But Edward lives. True, noble prince. Oh, bitter consequence that Edward still should live, true, noble prince. Cousin, thou wast not wont to be so dull. Shall I be plain? I wish the bastard's dead, and I would have it suddenly perform. What sayst thou now? Speak suddenly, be brief. Now, you'll notice that Buckingham is trying not to understand him, and that he also, when he's Richard is not letting him have any time to think. He's pushing him. And Richard doesn't want to let him have any time to think. Buckingham says, give me a minute, let me think about it. And that's not good enough for Richard. Richard decides, I can't trust Buckingham anymore. I'm not going to have anything to do with him. Buckingham comes back and reminds him of his promises to give him everything that he lost in the previous reign, the earldom of Hereford, and that's really why he's done it. And Richard is not interested in hearing this. Richard is, in fact, obsessing about who's supposed to be king next, and that's this guy named Richmond. I do remember me. Henry VI did prophesy that Richmond should be king when Richmond was a little peevish boy, a king. Perhaps. My lord, how chance the prophet could not at that time have told me, I being by, I should kill him? My lord, your promise for the earldom, Richmond, when last I was at Exeter, the mayor in courtesy showed me his castle, and called Rougemont, at which name I started, because a bard of Ireland told me once I should not live long after I saw Richmond. My lord, what's o'clock? I am thus bold to put your grace in mind of what you promised me. Ah, well, but what's o'clock? Upon the stroke of 10. Well, let it strike. Why let it strike? Because that like a jack thou keeps the stroke between thy begging and my meditation. I am not in the giving vein today. May it please you to resolve me in my suit? Thou troublest me, I am not in the vein. Now Buckingham knows that from Richard not being in the giving vein, not being in the mood to give him what he asked for, and from actually asking to have his head cut off is a tiny step. And Buckingham decides to leave. In fact, Buckingham decides to raise an army against him because he has nothing else to lose. Richard has decided that he can't trust Buckingham to have his little cousins, the little kids, killed, and so he's asked a man named Tyrrell to do it. Tyrrell has decided to hire some hitmen to do it. So when Tyrrell comes in, what we get is a double offstage relation. We get a third-hand relation. Tyrrell's telling us what Dighton and Forrest, the two great big hitmen, told him. And if you can imagine one of the great big goons from The Sopranos weeping over having to bump somebody off, that gives you an idea of what Dighton and Forrest are supposed to be like. And Dighton and Forrest go on about how cute the kids looked right before they killed them. "Oh, thus," quoth Dighton, "lay the gentle babes, thus, quoth Forrest, girdling one another within their alabaster innocent arms. Their lips were 4 red roses on a stalk, which in their summer beauty kissed each other. A book of prayers once on their pillows lay, which once," quoth Forrest, "almost changed my mind, but oh, the devil," there the villain stopped, when Dighton thus told on, "We smothered the most replenished sweet work of nature that from the prime creation ere she framed. Hence both are gone with conscience and remorse. They could not speak, and so I left them both to bear this tidings to the bloody king. And here he comes. All health, my sovereign lord. Kind Tyrrell, am I happy in thy news? If to have done the thing you gave in charge beget your happiness, be happy then, for it is done." So we don't get to see the kids killed on stage. We've had some onstage violence. We saw Clarence killed on stage, but we don't get to see the little kids killed on stage. And that's partly because Shakespeare can paint us a word picture that's much more effective than anything he can show us. And it's also because at this point we're supposed to feel pretty horrified at this. I think this is when our sympathy for Richard pretty much disappears. And for Tyrrell, when he's just finished talking about how these hardened thugs have wept like children at the idea of killing these children, and when Richard comes in saying, "Am I happy in your news?" the idea is, well, if that's the kind of thing that makes you happy, I guess you are. Richard before had said to his friend Catesby, "Go off, tell everybody that Anne is sick. I've got to do a bunch of things, I must be married to my brother's daughter or else my kingdom stands on brittle glass." So he had a to-do list. Kill the kids, get rid of the queen, marry my brother's daughter, do a bunch of stuff. And then we get him at the end of this scene, he's recapping everything he did. Check, 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 check. "The son of Clarence have I pent up close. His daughter meanly have I matched in marriage. The sons of Edward sleep in Abram's bosom, and Anne my wife hath bid this world good night. Now, for I know the Briton Richmond aims at young Elizabeth, my brother's daughter, and by that knot looks proudly on the crown. To her go I, a jolly thriving wooer." So he's going to try pulling the same thing with his niece that he did with Anne at the beginning of this play. The problem is, this time, it isn't going to work. Now, in Act 4, Scene 4, we suddenly get the woman's perspective. We have Queen Margaret. We haven't seen her since she laid everybody out in Act 1, since she did all of her curses. And she comes in pretty much just to gloat. I mentioned before that adversity doesn't seem to have sweetened her disposition any, and it really hasn't. When she sees the Duchess of York, who is Richard's mother and who is devastated by both the murders that have been committed in her family and also the fact that she is the mother to this murderer, and to Queen Elizabeth, who has lost both her husband and her children within a very short period of time, Margaret feels empathy. She knows just how they feel, but not sympathy. And when Elizabeth and the Duchess come in, they're very distressed. "Oh, my poor princes! Oh, my tender babes, my unblown flowers, new appearing sweets! If yet your gentle..."
5, 4, 3...
"Ah, my poor princes, ah, my tender babes, my unblown flowers, new appearing sweets, if yet your gentle souls fly in the air and be not fixed in doom perpetual, hover about me with your airy wings and hear your mother's lamentation." Hover about her. say that right for right hath dimmed your infant morn to aged night. And that's Margaret watching this and muttering to herself. And Queen Margaret feels that this is tit for tat, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. She lost her children, and now Queen Elizabeth has lost hers. And Queen Elizabeth makes the mistake of saying, "Ah, who hath any cause to mourn but we?" And Margaret steps forward. "If ancient sorrow be most reverent, give mine the benefit of seniority, and let my griefs frown on the upper hand. If sorrow can admit society, tell over your woes again by viewing mine. I had an Edward till a Richard killed him. Thou hadst an Edward till a Richard killed him. Thou hadst an Edward till a Richard killed him. Thou hadst a Richard till a Richard killed him. I had a Richard too, and thou didst kill him. Thou had a Rutland too, thou helpst to kill him." And that's the Duchess of York stepping in and saying, "Hold it, you actually committed some murders yourself," and that's absolutely true. These three women who have been at the highest echelon of society are now reduced to wearing entirely black and sitting on the ground, which is a position of tremendous humility. There wasn't a problem with this in the Elizabethan stage because the actors were higher than the audience's heads, or at least around the same height, so they could still see them. And Margaret starts to go into some very formal speech. We started to hear all those Richards and Edwards, and this is the point where a lot of people sort of give up and think, "Oh my goodness, I can never keep them straight." Well, Shakespeare didn't make up the names, but he certainly had fun with them. At this point, as I said, Margaret starts to get very formal in the language, and she starts to repeat things a lot. Formal language to us sounds a little odd as a way of expressing emotion, but if you think of it as sort of heightening the tension or heightening the emotion, that's what's going on. "From forth the kennel of thy womb hath crept a hellhound that does hunt us all to death. That dog that had his teeth before his eyes to worry lambs and lap their gentle blood, that foul defacer of God's handiwork, that excellent grand tyrant of the earth that reigns in galled eyes of weeping souls, thy womb let forth to chase us to our graves. O upright, just, and true disposing God, how do I thank thee that this carnal cur preys on the issue of his mother's body and makes her pew fellow with others' woes." And so that's her, all the that, this, that cur, that dog. Cur is just another word for dog. Richard is compared to a dog, especially a savage dog, many times in this play, almost as many times as he's referred to as a hog or a boar. Again, later, Queen Margaret reflects back on the things that she had called Elizabeth, that she was not, she was just the picture of the things that she really was, that Elizabeth is essentially a paper doll queen. And now she uses this rhetorical figure called antithesis, which just means opposite. If you can think of these things as two parts of an old-fashioned balance scale, she is reflecting on what Elizabeth's station was and what it is now. And of course she's rubbing it in. "Where is thy husband now? Where be thy brothers? Where be thy two sons? Wherein dost thou joy? Who sues and kneels and says, God save the Queen? Where be the bending peers that flattered thee? Where be the thronging troops that followed thee? Decline all this and see now what thou art. For happy wife, a most distressed widow. For joyful mother, one that wails the name. For one being sued to, one that humbly sues. For queen, a very caitiff crowned with care. For she that scorned at me, now scorned of me. For she being feared of all, now fearing one. For she commanding all, obeying none. Thus hath the course of justice whirled about, and left thee but a very prey to time, having no more but thought of what thou wast, to torture thee the more, being what thou art. And so this rhetorical figure of antithesis is a way that Margaret uses to do the contrasting. That's important when you think about Shakespeare's use of language in order to create dramatic tension. Elizabeth begs Margaret to teach her how to curse. This is something, again, that Margaret had predicted. And Margaret's advice is this: forbear to sleep the nights, and fast the days. Compare dead happiness with living woe. Think that thy babes were sweeter than they were, and he that slew him fouler than he is. Bettering thy loss will make the bad causer worse. Revolving this will teach thee how to curse. This is pretty much what a psychiatrist would tell you not to do if you wanted to get over something. It's just picking at the scab, and that's Margaret's advice. Never forget about it. Don't let it go. Just sort of make yourself as bitter as possible. Richard comes in. His mother has really had it with him. She is fed up, and she curses him. And this is a mother's curse. It's the sort of thing that would bother even Richard. Therefore take with me my most grievous curse, which in the day of battle tire thee more than all the complete armor which thou wearest. My party's prayers on the adverse party fight, and there the little souls of Edward's children whisper the spirits of thine enemies, and promise them success and victory. Bloody thou art, bloody will be thy end, shame serves thy life, and doth thy death attend. So she's basically saying, I'm going to pray for your enemies. And, Richard just blows that off at this moment. But later we'll see it bothers him a great deal, as you can imagine, his mother cursing him. He then moots to Queen Elizabeth the idea that he should marry her daughter. Now, this is his niece, which is one problem with it. Another thing is that, of course, everybody knows what happened to his previous wife, which is that even though they can't prove it, they're pretty sure that he got rid of her. I should hasten to add that this is probably not historically true. If you want more details, you should check the Richard III Society website for their version of what happened. They're basically dedicated to the proposition that Richard was a really nice guy once you get to know him. And Queen Elizabeth and Richard go through a scene that's very similar to the one that he had with Lady Anne. She's at first arguing with him. She's refusing to listen to him. He asks what way he can woo her daughter, and she says, well, send her 2 hearts engraved with the names of her brothers. Send her a handkerchief steeped in their blood, and then maybe that'll make her cry. That'll make her love you, all right. And Richard says, you're kidding me. That won't work. He starts to get very angry, and it's very dangerous to make Richard angry. And so Elizabeth seems to relent, and she leaves, giving Richard the hope that she is in fact going to follow what he told her to do. And of course, the moment she's off the stage, Richard has the same kind of contempt for her that he had for Anne. Relenting fool and shallow, changing woman. The difference here is that she's lying. She has no intention of telling her daughter to marry Richard. In fact, she's going to get her to marry Richard's enemy, Richmond, as quickly as she possibly can to try to save her daughter. So this is where Richard has maybe overplayed his hand. Richard's getting more and more paranoid. He's lost his best friend and best plotter, Buckingham, who is now fighting with him. All these messengers start to run in and bringing him bad news. And finally, the third messenger who comes in, he actually hits him before he can tell what the news is. And it turns out that that was good news. So Richard apologizes, which is, I think, the only time he apologizes in this play. Buckingham is captured, and all of these people have been reflecting backwards on what happened and who cursed them. Buckingham, like Anne, actually cursed himself. We didn't go into detail in that part, but he'd vowed to Queen Elizabeth that if he was ever false to her or to her children, may terrible things light on his head. And of course they did. It's not smart to say things like that in a Shakespearean history play, and of course that's exactly what happens. Buckingham is the last to go out. He reflects on the fact that this is All Souls Day. You may know that day by its more modern Mexican title, the Day of the Dead. It's November 2nd, and he thinks it's a very appropriate day for me to die. It's a very appropriate day for me to become a ghost. Now, everybody has been reflected back on. Let's review. Who has Richard shafted so far? Henry VI, Edward the Prince of Wales, Clarence, Rivers, Vaughan and Grey, the kids, and finally Buckingham. Oh yes, and Hastings. And more or less that is the way they come in the ghost scene. So Richard actually envisions them all as ghosts, and this is a great chance for the actors who played those roles to come back for a little final bow. Richard and Richmond, who is, as I said, Queen Elizabeth's different Queen Elizabeth, grandfather, is about to fight against Richard. And the two of them pitch their tents on the stage. And this is a very small stage. And they have to pretend that there's a vast difference between the two. I cannot prove this, but my bet is that Richard pitches his tent down there, and that Richmond pitches his tent down there. There's a reason for that. When you look at me, even though this is my right and this is my left, from your point of view, this is the left and this is the right. And for Richard to be on the left hand, that's the bad side, the evil side. And of course, some of you may know that if you were left-handed until fairly recently, teachers started to try to force you to write with your right hand because that's the correct hand. It's associated with evil and all of these other things. And so, of course, Richard has to be on the left-hand side. There's another reason why Richard has to be on the left-hand side, and that is that the ghosts come in counterclockwise. They come in through this upstage door. There are doors in the upstage rather than on the sides. That's the Elizabethan standard staging. They come in through this upstage door, down this way to talk to Richard. They go over that way to talk to Richmond, and they go back up there to exit through the upstage door. Well, why counterclockwise? Well, just like left and right, counterclockwise is considered the bad direction. Probably the witches in the Scottish play dance in that direction too. And so the ghosts have to go in this counterclockwise motion because they're ghosts, they're creepy. And all of the ghosts become something that prey on Richard's mind. Henry VI, we didn't even get to see him alive. We just got to see him as a corpse. And they keep telling to him, despair and die, despair and die. And then they say to Richmond, live and flourish, something that I always think of in terms of Star Trek, live long and prosper. It's one way to remember it. But in fact, it is live and flourish. So they all go around in this thing. First, Henry VI, and then Clarence, who now has no illusions about Richard's character. Let me sit heavy in thy soul tomorrow, I that was washed to death in fulsome wine. Poor Clarence, by thy guile betrayed to death. Tomorrow in the battle think on me, and fall thy edgeless sword. Despair and die. Thou offspring of the house of Lancaster, the wronged heirs of York do pray for thee. Good angels guard thy battle, live and flourish. Rivers, Grey, and Vaughan come in as a group. That's because they're not so important as individual characters that we want to give them their own entrance. The two young princes, Edward and Richard, again, the names are repeated, come in and talk to Richard first. Dream on thy cousin smothered in the tower. Let us be led within thy bosom, Richard, and weigh thee down to ruin, shame, and death. Thy nephew's souls bid thee despair and die. Sleep, Richmond, sleep in peace and wake in joy. Good angels guard thee from the boar's annoy. Live and beget a happy race of kings. Edward's unhappy sons do bid thee flourish. Despair and die, live and flourish. You also have a lot of repetitive and fall thy edgeless sword. Anne, who has been kept awake with Richard's nightmares for however long she was married to him, now gets a little bit of her own back. She gets to become one of his nightmares and keep him awake. Richard, thy wife, that wretched Anne, thy wife, that never slept a quiet hour with thee, now fills thy sleep with perturbations. Tomorrow in the battle think on me, and fall thy edgeless sword, despair and die. Thou quiet soul, sleep thou a quiet sleep, dream of success and happy victory. Thy adversary's wife doth pray for thee, and she goes out. The last to come in is Buckingham, and he specifically says, the first was I that helped thee to the crown, the last was I that felt thy tyranny. Because Buckingham is the last, he has a slightly different tone on it. Fainting, dream on of bloody deeds and death. Fainting, despair, despairing, yield thy breath. So that's a way of making it a little different. And Richard wakes up in a cold sweat. This is the first time we get to see Richard go to pieces. Give me another horse, bind up my wounds. Have mercy, Jesu. Soft I did but dream. O coward conscience, how dost thou afflict me? The lights burn blue. It is now dead midnight. Cold, fearful drops stand on my trembling flesh. Who do I fear? Myself? There's none else by. Richard loves Richard. That is, I am I. Is there a murderer here? No. Yes. I am. Then fly. What? From myself? Great reason why, lest I revenge. What? Myself upon myself? Alack, I love myself. Wherefore? For any good that I have done? Oh no, I rather hate myself for hateful deeds committed by myself. I am a villain, yet I lie, I am not. Fool, of thyself speak well. Fool, do not flatter. My conscience brings in 1,000 several tongues, and every tongue brings in a several tale, and every tale condemns me for a villain. Perjury, perjury in the highest degree. Murder, stern murder in the direst degree. All several sins, all crying, guilty, guilty. I shall despair. There is no creature loves me. And if I die, no man will pity me. And wherefore should I, since that I myself find in myself no pity toward myself? Now, he's really been brought down to the blackest pit of despair. He is horrified of himself because when he looks in the mirror, he sees a murderer, and he can't run from himself. And that's just the way things are. He has really acknowledged that he is the monster that he has created. He is his own monster. And he has no love for himself, no pity for himself. And so in a way, he's a walking corpse. He's not going to make it through the battle, even though he puts on a good show. Richmond, who is the good guy, encourages his troops by saying, you're fighting God's battle. This is very familiar. Fighting God's battle, and, you're going to conquer this great tyrant, and it's going to be good. And, even if you die, you'll be dying in a good cause. And Richard plays the fear card. He says, if you don't fight this guy, he's going to rape your wives and daughters. He's going to do all these terrible things, which we know Richmond is not going to do. And so he is appealing to the really lower nature of his soldiers. Despite the fact that he's about as terrified as he possibly can be, he races around the stage, insisting that he's going, he needs to find another horse. He has a horse killed from under him, and he's looking for a horse. And that's probably the most famous line in this play. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. And one of the things that is a bit of a misnomer is when people read this play, when you read this play, you will see something that says, enter King Richard and Richmond, they fight, Richard is slain. And I've had students before say, well, it must be a very short fight. That's very unlikely. The Renaissance, they loved their stage fighting, and most of the actors were masters of fence. They probably fought with several different weapons. They probably made this battle, even though they could only have had a few actors actually on the stage, as scary looking and realistic as they possibly could. So don't think just because the stage directions here are short that means that the fight is actually short. Another thing you might like to know while we're talking about stage directions is that Shakespeare puts in very few actual stage directions. The original ones are the ones that are not in brackets, and almost all of the stage directions that appear are in brackets. That means that the editor has put them in. Why doesn't Shakespeare put in stage directions? Well, of course, we don't have his original manuscripts, but it's probably because he could tell the actors what he wanted. They probably knew, and also what's supposed to happen is very often embedded in the speeches. So he didn't have to write out a complicated fight. He wasn't looking for us to read it. We were supposed to be watching it, and we were supposed to be watching an exciting fight. Stanley comes in, he's got the crown. The crown is wonderful, and this is terrific, and Richmond gets the crown. He's going to marry Elizabeth. These are the two houses of York and Lancaster, the red and white roses of the Wars of the Roses, and England's civil wars are done. But just in case anybody in the audience should think about starting another one, it's a sort of a reference to what could happen now. Oh, now let Richmond and Elizabeth, the true succeeders of each royal house, by God's fair ordinance conjoin together, and let their heirs, God, if thy will be so, enrich the time to come with smooth-faced peace, with smiling plenty, and fair prosperous days. Abate the edge of traitors, gracious Lord, that would reduce these bloody days again, and make poor England weep in streams of blood. Let them not live to taste this land's increase, that would with treason wound this fair land's peace. Now civil wounds are stopped, peace lives again, that she may long live here. God say, Amen. Now, you can see that this play ends with a very emphatic bang. We have a couple of couplets, which tells us, the couplet always is indicating the end of a scene, and in this particular case really indicates the end of the whole play. Usually the highest ranking character on stage speaks the last lines, and doesn't get higher than Richmond because he is the new king, and he is also the founder of the Tudor dynasty, who is right now, at Shakespeare's time, on the throne. So this is a kind of Tudor propaganda. And everybody knew that. It wouldn't be unusual for the sort of coded message to be, hooray, we're so lucky to have Queen Elizabeth on the throne. Now, history plays are very challenging, and I'm sure you probably found reading this play very challenging too. Do read all the material. We've put a lot of information on the website to help you through dealing with all these complicated dynastic backstory things, and it should make it easier for you to follow. You'll want to check the approved web links I've given you. Go ahead and email me if you have any questions, and do enjoy the movie clips and pictures. We've got some really great ones with Ian McKellen and with Laurence Olivier. For next week, I'd like you to get started on reading Twelfth Night, and make sure to post to the discussion board. Next time, Twelfth Night.
Okay. Clear.
Okay.